The month started out with the Storm the US Capitol World event after an offshoot clan of players from the larger Trump faction claimed that the results of the November election update were illegitimate. This led to the entire area temporarily turning into a PvP zone, which led to several players losing their lives in the confusion. The response from then US faction leader, Donald Trump, then triggered a retaliation from the Big Tech Alliance, which executed Order 66 on every single social media account Mr. Trump was holding. The Swag News team reached out for a comment from Mr. Trump, however he was still server muted as of time of writing. He is now believed to be pursuing a career in the Florida skill tree, often considered to be the most feared in the US region. All attempts to find early life information on the new US faction leader have come up unfruitful, but it's believed that he fought bravely in the US War for Independence. We now come to what many would call the main event of January, the storming of the US Capitol. As always, we try to keep the clusterfuck coverage of US politics as unbiased as we can, because as an Australian, I really don't give a fuck. On the 6th of January, the US Congress convened to certify the results of the US presidential election. However, during the process, a number of Republican representatives objected to the results, citing allegations of voter fraud. As we've discussed extensively before, virtually all of these claims of voter fraud have been proven false by conservative, liberal, and non-partisan pundits alike, and they've been no truer now than when we first started covering them in the middle of last year. The president at the time, Donald Trump, was perhaps the biggest proponent of the election fraud allegations, and in the days leading up to the storming, encouraged his most loyal supporters to rally and display their disappointment with the democratic process. This is where things become a bit more interpretive. In the days leading up to the storming of the US Capitol, Mr. Trump's language is undoubtedly quite inflammatory, encouraging his supporters to fight, take back their country, and stop the stealing of the election. President Trump, among many of his traits, tends to be very vague in how he words his ideas, and as a result, it can often be difficult to tell whether he means something figuratively or literally. Regardless of his intentions, Mr. Trump was quite successful at rallying supporters for his cause. However, it quickly became clear that this crowd was not made up of the average Republican voter. Many of those attending came wearing Nazi memorabilia, anti-Semitic t-shirts, and Confederate flags, all of which are generally frowned upon by the wider public. With the crowd now energized and encouraged by both the president and by a number of members of Congress, these rapscallions decided to live in the moment and start the process of storming the US Capitol. Many in the crowd smashed windows, fought against riot police, and some, but not others, were able to climb over the protective walls. The ease of which many of the participants were able to enter the Capitol has understandably come into question, which has led to the FBI investigating the Capitol Police after reports of some officers stationed in the area cooperating with the crowd and even letting them past certain barricades. Once inside, the crowd made history once again, as even over the 4-year Civil War, the Confederate flag never made it inside the US Capitol, but the Confederate Army was no match for whoever this guy was. As of time of writing, 5 people lost their lives in the halls of Congress during the storming, including 1 police officer and a woman who was shot attempting to enter a room containing the vice president. The other 3 were members of the crowd who were either trampled, died of a stroke, or had a heart attack. A few other members of the crowd were found to have handcuffs and improvised explosives, but fortunately neither were used during the storming. While this was happening, President Trump took to Twitter and called several members of Congress, as well as Vice President Mike Pence, liars, cowards, and weak. The president was hesitant to clear a request from the mayor of DC to send in the National Guard to stop the Capitol storming. However, after several hours, Vice President Pence eventually made the call to send in National Guard support. Once they arrived, the Capitol building was quickly cleared out, and the area was then sanitized in order to ensure members of Congress could finish the count of electoral votes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, some Republican members decided to rescind their objections upon returning. Once the smoke cleared around the Capitol, the consequences for the president began to take shape. as social media companies began banning his accounts after making their own conclusions that he incited violence within DC. This kind of ban wave didn't stop at just Twitter, as Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Reddit, and Snapchat all banned Mr. Trump from their services, while Spotify, Pinterest, Shopify, Discord, and Stripe removed many communities associated with the president. Perhaps one of the most supportive social media sites of Mr. Trump, Parler, was taken down completely by Amazon's hosting service, but was later restored with the help of an overseas digital infrastructure company. A huge ban wave of conspiracy accounts over both Twitter and Facebook followed the US Capitol incident, which did of course raise the question of whether social media sites have too much power over what can and can't be said on the internet. Having a select handful of people essentially able to decide what is and isn't appropriate to be shared on social media sites is a scary concept, which becomes even more frightening when you consider that these are just employees of privately owned companies. At the same time, the ability for people to now live in their own insulated online bubble, which never challenges their beliefs and only serves to reinforce and radicalize their worldview, is arguably just as dangerous, and as demonstrated at the start of January, can have very real and meaningful consequences. This is a debate for another time, but unless this is addressed soon, it's very likely that such an incident may be repeated. Perhaps one of the strangest parts of the Capitol storming was that despite everyone involved committing an exciting cornucopia of crimes, many of the participants viewed the storming as a necessary and even patriotic pursuit. It would be easy to dismiss this perception as a fringe view by only some of the most loyal supporters of Mr. Trump. However, in a YouGov poll following the incident, 1 in 5 voters were found to approve of the Capitol storming. Unsurprisingly, like almost all political opinions within the country, the perception of the event was very much divided on party lines, with 45% of Republicans showing approval, as opposed to only 2% of Democrats. Interestingly, according to a poll taken mid-November, 52% of Republican voters also said that Mr. Trump rightfully won the presidential election. This is important to understand, especially to an outsider like myself, as many people unfamiliar with the state of politics in the United States would wonder why the fuck so many people would film themselves storming the Capitol, especially if they had no intention of hiding their identity. Due to this noble cause secret ingredient, the FBI was said to have had the best day in their history since George Bush passed the Patriot Act in 2001. As of time of writing, 100 arrests have already been made, with 100 more well on the way.
The infamous QAnon faction, a group united by its low intelligence stats, have once again amazed the world with its latest player-driven special event. Hundreds of members from the online cult converged in the fine city of Dallas this month, where it was hoped that they'd bear witness to the resurrection of JFK's son, on the very site his father was murdered in patch 19.63. President Kennedy's son famously died in a plane crash over 20 years ago. However, attendees were convinced that the resurrection of JFK Jr. would lead to him running for vice president alongside Donald Trump in the 2024 election. As you might have guessed, the ex-president's deceased son was not brought back to life, and although some of the attendees decided to stay within the area for up to a week after the event, data miners have found no such evidence of a planned resurrection mechanic anywhere in the game files.
People who watch this series often have likely noticed that we don't usually talk about Donald Trump, despite his almost superhuman ability to consistently make headlines around the globe. With this in mind, we usually skip over most of his related stories in favor of other events that have more of a lasting impact. This month, however, Mr. Trump saw his Florida estate raided by the FBI, which isn't exactly an insignificant event. The raid occurred after Mr. Trump was issued a subpoena in June, which related to classified documents that may have been taken upon his exit from the Oval Office. After failing to comply with the court-ordered subpoena for 3 months, his estate was subsequently raided by more than a dozen agents who were looking for 11 sets of documents marked as classified. It should be noted that although this is a pretty big deal in and of itself, it certainly isn't the first time a president or former president has received a subpoena. Thomas Jefferson was subpoenaed in 1807 for documents related to his vice president, Aaron Burr, who was on trial for treason. Richard Nixon was also subpoenaed and was ordered to submit the tapes of the recordings he took of Democratic officials. Lastly was Bill Clinton, who was ordered to testify in court after he absolutely had sexual relations with that woman.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
In terms of the search on Mr. Trump's estate, the FBI had to clear a pretty high bar for being able to conduct the raid in the first place, as they needed to convince a judge that they had sufficient evidence to believe that the documents were on the specific premises. Not only this, but the Justice Department also has a policy of not acting on sensitive matters that could be seen to interfere with the national election cycle, and as it's long rumored that Mr. Trump could be running for re-election in 2024, the timing was seen to be a critical factor. In general, it's not usually a violation of the law for a former president to take certain presidential records after their departure from the White House, and in most cases, former presidents are still given intelligence briefings, even when returning to civilian life. In this instance, however, the documents pertain to matters of national security, falling under Legal Code 793, and without getting too boring, this basically means that the information is deemed too important to be taken home. In a strange twist of fate, Trump himself famously signed a bill into law in 2018, which limited the scope of classified documents that a president is allowed to take home from the office, and harshened the punishment for violating this law. Mr. Trump had also appointed the current director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, as well as the judge who authorized the search warrant in the first place. As of time of writing, we don't currently know what kind of documents the agents could have been searching for, as the FBI state that revealing any specific information at this time is not in the best interest of either the case or the general public. What we do know, however, is at least one of these documents has been set at the nation's highest classification level, meaning they weren't about to fuck around in getting it back. What this means for Mr. Trump is difficult to say. If Mr. Trump is found to have willfully attempted to conceal, remove, or destroy any such documents, he could be looking at a hefty fine or up to 3 years in prison. More significantly, however, he would also be disqualified for holding any office under the United States, meaning his rumored re-election campaign could be firmly dead in the water. Harsh critics of Mr. Trump have theorized that this former president of the United States intended to commit treason against his own country by conspiring with the enemies of America. On the other hand, adamant supporters of the former president have accused the operation as being a politically motivated stunt designed to smear his chances at a re-election. What's most likely, however, is that Mr. Trump, as he claims, simply thought he had the all clear to take the documents home, which prompted the FBI to do whatever it took to conceal the highly sensitive information. Whatever the case, we are currently only able to work with the information available to the public, so short of breaking headlines released 10 minutes before this video goes live, this is what we know so far. Donald Trump admits to using classified documents to block a light in his room at night, cementing himself as the most giga-chad president.
One character that our team tends to avoid covering has made the news yet again, and unfortunately, we are unable to ignore this story. On the 4th of this month, District Attorney of Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, announced the indictment of former WWE superstar and former US President Donald Trump, becoming the first former or sitting US president to be charged with a criminal act. In total, Mr. Trump faces 34 counts of falsifying business records in the state of New York related to the matter of allegedly concealing damaging information prior to the 2016 election. According to a statement from the district attorney's office, Mr. Trump and his allies utilized a so-called catch and kill scheme. In this alleged plan, Mr. Trump and his cohorts would go to great lengths to identify stories that could hamper his campaign, purchase the exclusive rights to them, and then bury the information. Additionally, to further conceal paper trails of suspected illegal transactions, the district attorney's office claims Mr. Trump and company falsified business records submitted for inspection. As a consequence for these actions, Mr. Bragg and his team have requested that the court impose a $250 million fine against Mr. Trump, while also disbarring him or his 2 children. Ivanka and Eric Trump from serving in an executive position for any corporation registered in the state of New York. The details that follow were so perplexing to our very own Jack the intern that we believe he might have hurt himself in his own confusion. The prosecution in this case is focusing on a very specific payment of $130,000 to the adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Viewers may recall prior to the 2016 election, Miss Daniels publicly confessed to having an alleged affair with Mr. Trump. At the time, this could have potentially caused a scandal among some of Mr. Trump's more religious fans. In order to prevent Miss Daniels from spreading the story further, she was reportedly paid $130,000 in hush money while being threatened both physically and legally if she did not accept the terms of the agreement. From a legal point of view, making a payment to an adult film actress for their silence on a given matter is generally not illegal in the United States. However, it is a crime to lie on financial records about what certain payments are for and who they were addressed to. Compelling an individual to accept the payment for silence might also fall under the definition of coercion, which, as of time of writing, is still illegal in the United States. In the event that Mr. Trump is found guilty of all charges currently presented, he would not be disbarred from running for office again. As in the United States, there is no federal law preventing a convicted criminal from running in an election. The public reaction to the indictment has been about as predictable as a new 7 out of 10 Call of Duty title releasing every year. On the left, there seem to be two predominant lines of thought. On one hand, some see the indictment as pointless and even beneficial for Trump due to him still being able to run for office and potentially gaining an upper hand on fundraising from his base. On the other hand, some think that this is simply the legal system operating as it should, and there should be consequences for someone's actions. Coincidentally, the reaction on the right has been unsurprisingly the polar opposite. Not only have claims of conspiracies and collusion from the district attorney's office permeated among supporters of the former president, but the indictment of Mr. Trump has spurred a wave of massive fundraising for his re-election campaign. This comes as Mr. Bragg and his staff have received threats, with a letter even being sent to the attorney's office filled with a white powder and an accompanying note that read, "Alvin Bragg, I am going to kill you," hours after Mr. Trump warned of death and destruction if he was to be indicted. For additional context, as of time of writing, Mr. Trump is actively facing multiple legal challenges. In the state of Georgia, he faces potential charges for attempting to overturn the election results in the state. In New York, there is another financial fraud case in the works, plus a civil defamation case against the former president about allegations of sexual assault, as well as multiple other civil and criminal charges pending in several different states across the country. According to recently released statistics, just over half of all Americans view this indictment as justified, with 80% of Democrats, 50% of independents, and 30% of Republicans sharing that opinion. Alternatively, the belief that this was exclusively a politically motivated decision in order to make Mr. Trump look bad is held by 70% of Republicans. The belief that the decision was evidence-based was held by roughly 46% of those polled, with 43% believing that this was a politically motivated maneuver.
And 35% said they were confused by the way the question was posed.
While not the most groundbreaking revelation to some, this highlights the radically different positions held by almost equal parts of the electorate and displays the polarization of the modern political climate in the US. It is unlikely that Mr. Trump will see a courtroom until at least May, so unfortunately for us, we will have to keep tabs on the trial and provide updates on it, as long as it is newsworthy.
We now bring you an update on everyone's favorite orange man who just ran the land of Uncle Sam. Former President of the United States Donald Trump was recently found liable for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. A New York jury in a civil trial found him responsible for sexually abusing Carroll in a Manhattan department store in the 90s and subsequently defaming her character. This comes after Carroll published a memoir in 2019 recounting when Donald Trump took advantage of her in the department store's dressing room. Trump responded to the accusations by denying them and saying, quote, "Number one, she's not my type. Number two, it never happened." Months later, Carroll would sue Donald Trump for defamation and would file a second lawsuit in late November 2022 against the former president. This second lawsuit cited battery and further defamation after Trump went on social media and called the entire case, quote, "a complete con job, hoax, and lie," while doubling down on the fact that, quote, "she's not my type." With the first trial coming to a close, Carroll was awarded $2 million in damages related to charges of battery and an additional $3 million in damages for defamation. This is one of Donald Trump's first official verdicts following a series of legal cases and lawsuits brought against him before, during, and after his presidency. This also marks the first time in US history that a former or sitting president has been found guilty civilly of sexually abusing someone. As we've covered previously, Mr. Trump was charged last month in regards to falsifying business records, with litigation for that case expected to begin sometime in early 2024. In addition, Mr. Trump also faces legal challenges in regards related to election interference, the storming of the Capitol, the handling of classified documents, and many more ongoing investigations. As more of these investigations and litigations come to a close, we will keep you up to date and strive to keep as much of the bullshit out of our coverage as possible.
What if it's me looking down on me? The world above must also be